Conversations podcast.
Welcome back, everyone. And I'm here with Catherine Orian Weiss today. She's a lecturer in sociology at Charles Sturt University in Albury-Wodonga. Some of her research focuses on disaster communication for migrant and refugee communities. She's a NAATI-certified translator, and she has been an interpreter and translator for over a decade. She is here with me today on the Conversation podcast to talk about communication in disaster situations for multilingual communities. So, Catherine, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. This topic that you're researching, communication in disaster context, is a very timely and interesting topic. I've heard of similar issues discussed, for example, in Japan after the earthquakes, but it has gained a lot of traction, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. Am I correct in saying that you started your research as a result of the pandemic as well?
No, actually, I wasn't involved in this project at its initial outset, but I think that it was actually provoked more because of the bushfires in 2019 to 2020, that very strong bushfire season that we had back then. So it was, around the same time as the start of the COVID pandemic, but I think that was more of the, yeah.
Okay, excellent. I suppose that was a situation as well that brought to light a lot of gaps in the communication when a crisis hits. What brought you to the research in particular?
Well, it was begun by some colleagues, mostly based at La Trobe University in Melbourne, and so I kind of joined that research in 2023, I think, because I have a background in research in the topic of gender and disaster. I've been working on that issue since about 2010, and I think also my translation and interpreting experience, which came from a separate kind of origin, was also an important, a relevant factor in a really useful factor in terms of doing that research.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so can you define for us what disaster context is? I mean, we've mentioned the bushfires now and the COVID pandemic, but what do you define as a disaster?
Well, I guess a disaster, it can mean a lot of different things, but in our project, we're specifically focusing on what is often known as natural disasters. So things like bushfires, floods, earthquakes, landslides, cyclones, things like that. And so we're focusing on those types of disasters. And we call them disasters, not natural disasters, because we're focusing on the fact that disasters are socially constructed. They're things that come about when some natural occurrence happens, like a bushfire, but then it's the way that natural occurrence interacts with human society and the way human society is organized that turns it into a disaster. So that's why we call them disasters, not natural disasters. And I think this understanding is really relevant to translators and interpreters because it's the way that society is organized in terms of how people communicate to one another, how communication happens to people who prefer not to use English or the dominant language in a particular place. That's what's really relevant in terms of this particular research.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what type of communication is paramount in this situation?
Well, I guess that's one of the findings of our research actually, is that different communities have different preferences for communication. So one of the communities that we talked to in our research was a Congolese community in Albury-Wodonga. And the other community that we talked to was the Indian community in Albury-Wodonga. So they had quite different experiences. They had quite different migration pathways to end up in Albury-Wodonga. But for example, the Congolese community is mostly fairly recent humanitarian migrants, and they often don't have very high levels of English. And something that was really clear in the results is that their preference for communication is very much to prefer talking to someone. It doesn't have to be face-to-face. It could be over the phone. It could even be by message, like WhatsApp, for example. But it needed to be some kind of verbal communication of some kind, or I guess written, but some kind of direct communication from someone is very much the type of communication that is dominant in that particular community. But that's quite a different way of communicating from mainstream Australian society, and the mainstream Australian society is kind of what emergency communication is focused on. So, I guess if I was, as someone who grew up in Australia, if I wanted to find out about what was going on with a disaster or an emergency, I would Google it. I'd look information on a website. Maybe there would be an app that I could use, and that there are apps that everyone can use, but these are very much not the kind of the first options that the Congolese community would take to find out about these things. Instead, they would call a friend, they would call a family member, that kind of thing. So,
for the English speaking population in Australia, there's usually the news and apps, as you said, or websites that they can look at. But some communities don't like to use this or don't have access to it because they're not translated. Is that the case?
Yes, that's definitely part of it. So a lot of that information, like if you turn on the news, for example, it's only in English unless you're able to access, the SBS news services in different languages. But it's also, I think, just a cultural practices as well, that if in certain cultures the way that people are used to communicating with one another is just to go and talk to someone, then they're not necessarily going to have the reflex to go and look on a website, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. If they come from a country, for example, where information isn't often put on the internet, like the government just doesn't do that, then you wouldn't be used to going to look there for that kind of information.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess why I was asking this question is because Australia is known to have quite an advanced community interpreting setting. So what makes the disaster context so different and unique that to other contexts in which interpreting is provided, that the system we have becomes so ineffective?
I think that the thing about emergency interpreting, or crisis interpreting is what it's often called in the academic literature, is that there's a very immediate need there in terms of life and death situations. If you think about being there's a bushfire coming, you may only have a few hours to act in order to keep yourself safe. Same with a flood. And that's quite different from a lot of other community interpreting settings where, there can still be really important issues, which maybe could relate to life and death situations if it's something, for example, in terms of like access to welfare or medical care and things like that. But it's not usually as immediately important, if you see what I mean. The speed in which you have to understand the information is maybe not quite as pressing, on average at least. There are certainly situations where that's not true. So I think what the implication for that really is that, the typical dominant standards for interpreting and translation that we have in Australia about accuracy and fidelity to the source text and things like that. If being loyal to the source text means that the person who's receiving the information can't understand it because they don't have the contextual background knowledge that would help them interpret it, do we really want to be sticking to that standard in that particular context?
Yes, so the topic of accuracy is something that I'll ask you again about later because it's very interesting. But before we move on to the findings of your research, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on what gaps there are in this type of communication that made your team want to research this topic? What kind of gaps in disaster communication did become apparent during the bushfires or during the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I think that what motivated the team to look into this topic is that it was actually media stories, firstly arising during the bushfires from communities who were saying that they felt completely abandoned and left out, and that they didn't receive any information in languages that they could understand about the bushfires, also about floods as well. There's been some media coverage of that as well. And then during COVID, there was also, I'm sure you remember, I remember it, a lot of coverage of the way in which the sort of government-run translations weren't working very well, and you got issues with translation that was half in Farsi and half in Arabic, things like that. So I think that was also a bit of a something that prompted the research to look into these issues.
And your research is based in Albury-Wodonga. Why did you choose these localities to base your research in?
Well, it was partly a practical issue because La Trobe University has a campus in Albury-Wodonga, so we had some contacts there. And I now have since moved to Charles Sturt University, based in Albury. So it was partly those kind of local connections that we had, but also because it's a fairly large regional town, which has a pretty large community, or a number of different communities of people from countries other than Australia. And also, because it's a border town between New South Wales and Victoria, that means it's sort of affected by two different systems of emergency management, because emergency management is something that is managed at the state level of government, and so Victoria and New South Wales have different systems, and so we thought that would be interesting in that context as well, to look at the way the two states, the effects of being in a border town, might impact these issues.
Was the fact that it's a regional town also an important element why you chose Albury-Wodonga?
Yeah, so I think because regional areas tend to be more heavily affected by disasters, that was the main reason. But also, the dynamics of communities, migrant and refugees communities in regional towns are a bit different as well to the cities. There's, can be less support, things like that, since migration to regional areas is a bit of a newer phenomenon.
Okay, so the findings of your research mentioned that there's actually a lack of information for culturally and linguistically diverse communities in any language, let alone in a specific language that community speaks. But there's also some specific issues related to the work of translators and interpreters. Could you elaborate a little bit on what these issues are?
So I guess an important overarching finding that we had is that there wasn't any information that was getting to a lot of our participants, especially the ones who were more recently arrived and had less English. So, I don't even know if there was information that was translated into Swahili or Congolese Swahili for the Congolese community in Albury-Wodonga, because if there was information that was translated, our participants didn't know about it. So, it's an issue of, it's not just an issue of translation and interpreting. I actually think that's a secondary issue. It's an issue of that no one has come up with a way to communicate to communicate to these communities that there is information that they need to know about disasters. And then sort of once that information flow has been established, then the issue of getting it into a language that they can understand is sort of second in that hierarchy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I suppose because of the need for quick communication in these situations, it's almost more important to get the message across somehow, and then make it nice, I suppose, or make it a nice translation becomes a secondary issue, something that we have to look at. Perhaps for information that is sent out on a more regular basis, it can always be on that topic. I know that, for example, there's information on how to react during bushfires that is sent out regularly as well, as a prevention for these situations. That should probably be translated with more care. But then when the crisis actually strikes, the important thing is to try and get the message across. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we definitely found that. Personally, I worked with the Congolese participants, so I know more about that particular community. So I don't want to speak for the Indian community, but the Congolese participants didn't have any understanding of preparation, the idea of, being prepared for an emergency in advance. And something that a lot of them said is that, we would like to have this information earlier so that we're not finding out about the bushfire when we see it coming over the hill. It's a slight exaggeration, but it's pretty close to what some of the participants said. Yeah, so it's about getting that information to communities, before the actual crisis hits, so that they know what's coming. They have a bit of idea of what to expect and how to react in that situation. And then during the actual disaster, that's another time when information needs to come, and obviously the means of communication in that situation will be a bit different.
Yeah, so do you think that the employment of professionals to translate that material would not make such much of a difference, or do you think it could be a solution to have translators and interpreters involved more?
It's a good question, and I don't think that I have a very clear answer to that at this point, partly because that isn't the question that our study was seeking to answer. So we didn't actually answer questions to specifically, get a response to that. But I think, there are a lot of issues in terms of sort of using official translations. Firstly, it's very expensive to translate things, thoroughly and well, and to have them checked for accuracy and things like that. And very often, the government sort of organisation of these things targets only the languages that are most widely spoken, which is great for, that covers the majority of non-English speakers in the state or in the country. But then what about people like the Congolese community in Albury-Wodonga who speak Congolese Swahili? Even Swahili from Kenya and Tanzania isn't really comprehensible to them. It's quite a different dialect of Swahili. So what do you do in those situations where it's not really financially feasible to use the methods that we currently have for official translations to translate into all of the hundreds of languages that people speak in Australia? So that's one of the issues here.
Yeah. So what do your findings show? What do you think could be a solution to get this information out to the Congolese community?
I think that, again, it's not something we've really, we haven't kind of come up with a full answer to that question yet. But I think that what we're finding is that it may be something that is less, maybe there needs to be some more flexibility in terms of the translation models that are used, translation interpreting models. Sorry.
That's okay. What are you referring to when you talk about translation models?
Yeah, I guess what I mean is the standard model where you have, for example, you call up and you get a phone interpreter if there's no one available in that place. That didn't work for the Congolese participants because the interpreter wouldn't speak Congolese Swahili. They'd be from Kenya or Tanzania. They didn't know them, therefore they didn't trust them. So a community interpreter model actually worked best. And this information actually came from one of the Indian participants who worked as a contact tracer during COVID. So she told us about that. But again, it wasn't something that we heard directly from the Congolese participants because we weren't asking them questions about that.
So when you say that a community interpreter is preferred, does that mean a professional community interpreter, or are you referring to a member of the community that is interpreting for them?
Yeah, so I mean a member of the community that's interpreting for them.
Mm-hmm. And is that because of an issue of trust? They prefer to talk to somebody they know so that they can get the information from somebody they trust?
Yes, that did seem to be part of the issue. But again, because we didn't really ask questions specifically about that, I only have this one kind of anecdote that indicated that it did, and that particular interviewee did think that it was an issue of trust.
You mentioned that there's a problem with the concept of accuracy that translators usually, it's part of our code of ethics, so we need to abide by that. What is the issue with accuracy in disaster communication?
Well, I guess when I'm talking about accuracy, I'm talking about accuracy in terms of staying loyal to the source text, so that notion of fidelity to the source text, which is what the Code of Ethics puts the emphasis on. But if the source text for it is talking about uses the word fire, for example, so someone who's grown up in Australia or someone who has lived here for a long time would probably recognise that in the context, fire refers to bushfire. But a maybe a newly arrived immigrant would not recognize that and would see the word fire and would think that it refers to house fire. And this is something that the Congolese participants in our research did a lot. We would ask them a question using the word fire or bushfire, and then it would be, so we were working with community members who were interpreting for participants, and they would respond with an answer that was talking about house fire. So if the source text, for example, uses the word fire, would it be inaccurate to translate that as bushfire, even if that's not exactly what's in the source text, for example?
So do you have any suggestions for translators and interpreters that do find themselves to work in the disaster context on how to minimize issues like that?
I think firstly being aware of some of the reasons why people might not be, aware of the context surrounding disasters. And this is, these are things that we come across in all sorts of different situations in interpreting and translation. But I guess in our study, one of the things that we came up against is that people didn't know about disasters in Australia because they hadn't grown up here, so they didn't grow up being used to those disaster contexts. Or, if you live here for a long time, then you also learn about it. But if they had just been recently arrived, for example. And so the Indian participants, for example, said that, they don't really have bushfires in India because it's tropical, it's too humid. So the whole notion of bushfire is completely foreign to these particular Indian participants. And the Congolese participants, they said they do have bushfires in their countries, but the government doesn't do anything about it. So they're not aware that, there are services that are going to try and fight the bushfire and are going to try and alert people what to do in that situation. And therefore they don't look out for them. And if they do see them, they maybe don't understand what they're intending to do. So I guess being aware of those contextual issues, and again, these are things that we come across in all sorts of different situations in interpreting and translation. But already, having an awareness of what kind of background knowledge the particular community may or may not have, I think that would be helpful, because then you might be able to know, oh, okay, well, this community, they don't really know anything about bushfires. So maybe when I use the word fire, they might interpret that differently. So maybe I need to use the word bushfire all the time if that's not exactly what's in the source text.
If I remember correctly, one of the examples that you mentioned is also skin cancer, the issue with skin cancer in Australia. What can you tell us about that compared to how the Congolese or Indian community reacted to information on that?
Yeah, sure. So again, that was another example, a similar example there that was from a Congolese community member who said, he didn't know when he first came to Australia that there was a risk of skin cancer from being out in the sun for too long. Because he said, in the Congo it's hot, but it's not. But hotness doesn't create sickness. That was sort of the exact quote that he used. Whereas in Australia, it does. Well, there is a risk of skin cancer because of the hole in the ozone layer and the higher amounts of UV radiation in Australia compared to the Congo. And so it was, again, I guess, that thing of, well, you might be familiar with a particular phenomenon. So in this case, heat, sun. And also similarly, the Congolese community, they were familiar with the notion of bushfires, but some ways in which it differs in Australia were things that they were not familiar with. And so they might have been extrapolating from the situation, their experience of that phenomenon in their home country, and assuming it's the same here, but it's actually not.
Yeah, I feel like so this is all messaging that comes from the government, right? So when there's a disaster situation, the government has to inform the community on how to react and what to do. And for example, in the case of bushfires, the Congolese community is not even expecting any type of communication because the government in their home countries doesn't deal with this sort of issues. So there's also, again, an element of trust in the information from the government. Is there some communities where there's less trust because the message actually comes from the government? Have you come across that as well?
I would be very unsurprised to come across that. It's not really something that we came across with the two communities that we looked at, but I think it would definitely be the case for some communities, absolutely. There are communities who have good reasons to not trust the government, including many communities in Australia.
But you have mentioned that, for example, the Indian community prefers to hear the message from a community member because there's higher trust there. Do you think there's anything that professional translators and interpreters can do to minimize this issue?
Well,
that trust with the community,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly know of interpreters and translators who have quite strong links with communities who they regularly do translation interpreting for. That's even the case with some of the interpreting that I do, that there is, it's with people who I have long-term relationships with, and I've done a lot of interpreting translation for them over the years. And so that does build up a relationship, which means that there's a level of trust if I say something that they would not have if it was, an interpreter and translator who was a stranger to them. And I certainly know of, it's not something I've personally done in Australia, but I certainly know of interpreters and translators who do that here. So when there are those interpreters and translators who have those long-term connections and links of trust with communities, that could be a way to overcome those issues.
I guess there could be an issue again there with professional boundaries and impartiality. So we would be getting back into discussing the code of ethics, but it's always a little bit tricky when there's a disaster involved and you need to have a quick response. In what ways do you think, or do you hope that your research will influence future studies, will develop now? What do you have planned next?
Well, we're working towards seeking funding to continue our research, to expand it, to look at more communities around Australia and potentially even, internationally, ultimately, because these issues are problems that come up all around the world in any place where there is kind of multilingual societies. We're hoping to look into, what kind of measures can be developed to help any community who's in this situation to be able to think about what measures they can put in place to be able to communicate better with people who don't speak the dominant language very well.
Did you come across some positive examples where this type of communication has worked?
Not really, to be honest. I'm sure there are some. I mean, even in our study, there were sort of positive examples, anecdotally, like of, for example, I remember one of the Congolese participants saying that they didn't know what to do, so they went and talked to their Australian neighbour, and the Australian neighbour was like, get in the car, do this, follow me. So, on that very micro level, there are many, positive examples of people who do have that knowledge, helping each other, and they did so in a way that was compatible with that particular Congolese community's preferences for face-to-face communication. I think there are a lot of positive examples out there. They're not necessarily things that have come up in academic research. For some reason, I don't quite understand. There's been very, very little research about the experiences of, migrant and refugee communities in disasters around the world, or at least in situations that are similar to Australia. So it's kind of a growing field of research, and we're hoping to contribute to that.
Mm-hmm. But there's nothing really that you've come across that can be translated on a macro level. Everything are just like specific situations that worked in that scenario. But is that what you're hoping to find with your research as well? Something that can be applied on a widespread level?
Yeah, and it wouldn't be that, because communities are so diverse and so different. It wouldn't be a blanket, this is what you should always do, but it might be some kind of a toolkit or some kind of series of suggestions, things to, a process to go through, to ask questions, to think about what communication networks exist already within communities, and to kind of tap into those as well. So yeah, that's more what we have in mind, I guess.
Okay, I think that's all the questions I had, Catherine. Thank you very much for coming to the podcast. I wish you good luck with your research and your next projects. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Conversations Podcast.